asking someone to move on, to like keep it hidden, doesn't allow them to express it. It also asks them to have a smaller life.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to In the House podcast. I'm Jenny Woon.
I'm Tony Singh.
And we have a guest today, Aly Bird. Let's give props, actually, to Catherine Worthy. She's an agent at and with Oakwood, actually, and she services Comox Valley. She's been an agent since 2001, who introduced us to Aly Bird. How are you
Yes,
doing,
I
Aly?
love Catherine. I'm so happy to be here.
So she felt that you would be a perfect fit for our listeners. And I want to introduce, a little bit of maybe a small introduction first before we get into some of the questions with you. Aly, you are author of Grief Ally, which is currently available on Amazon, Indigo, Barnes and Nobles. You just released it like last week, right?
Yeah, on January 25th.
Congratulations.
Okay. Congrats.
Thank you so much.
So excited. I attended your book launch, your book reading as well. I was only able to log on for the first 30 minutes. So I just felt like you have such a great following, such a great support group. So let's go into what we're here for, is to talk about Grief Ally, focusing on teaching people how to support their loved ones through their grieving and through unconditional love, by providing unconditional love and by providing empowerment. But let's start off, actually, before we always forget this.
You're so smart.
I see my notes.
I know. Go.
What is your spirit animal?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. I would probably love for it to be something exotic, but it's probably a dog, just like a regular old house dog that lounges around and just loves whoever will love them.
I love dogs.
They're
Okay.
incredible.
Yeah, they are. They're so loving. Perhaps we could start with what actually is grief. When people talk about grief, what is the definition of that? And what brought you through, working with grief, and why did you decide to want to create this book and messaging around the topic?
Yeah. So grief. Whew. So I think a lot of people have this assumption that grief is synonymous with sadness or melancholy. But grief is actually, you have to take a few steps back to really understand what grief is. And grief is really rooted in the notion that humans, we are wired to attach. We attach to people, we attach to places, we attach to things. And grief is an energy that's created when those attachments shift and change. And within that energy, it can manifest as any emotional experience: joy, relief, sadness, melancholy, excitement. But it isn't just sadness, which I think is really important for people to understand about grief. And I came into this work, I was just rolling along my merry little way, trying to make the best of my life. And then when I was 30, my husband, my partner, my beloved, the person that I chose to spend the rest of my life with, died in a hiking accident, completely unexpectedly, suddenly. And I was thrown into the deep end of grief without any understanding of what it was, how to live with it, and really like how I was going to exist for the rest of my life without this person that I thought was going to be there. But what drew me to write this book is that early in your grief process, a lot of people will send you the message of like, find community, find people who are like you. And I tried. I joined like nearly 13 different Facebook groups for widows of young and old of different life experience. And I really couldn't relate to the experiences that my peers were having because my support was so good. The people who loved me showed up despite being afraid and anxious and making mistakes. They were like, "We love you. We will be here for you. We will walk through this journey together with you, no matter what it looks like." And that has really given me the empowered me to be able to coexist with my grief in however it manifests on a daily basis, and still make the most of my life, which is unfortunate because not everybody gets that opportunity. So, having that privilege, having that support, I really wanted to put those lessons into something that other people can access, which is how the book was born. Because I have the smartest people around me. They are brilliant, they are loving, they are caring, but they were having to mine resources that were written for people like me at the epicenter of these really bad things.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to make a resource that is, for them. Um, and so when you get that phone call that you don't want to get, or you find out from a friend of a friend and be like, oh no, I have to say something, and you're like, I don't know what to say. There's a resource for you to go to, kind of calm that nervous, that anxious energy, and so you can channel it into being a really valuable source of support for someone who
Mm-hmm.
needs it.
Mm, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just can we, if you don't mind, can we just take a moment to honor your husband, your
Yeah.
partner? What's one thing that you learned from him about life?
Oh dear. He's a wise young man. His name was Will. We can say his name. His name was Will. Um, Will had this outlook on life where he really didn't sweat any of the small stuff.
Mm,
He was very much, what is worth my time, I will give it my time. And if it's not worthy of my time, let's forget about it. Um, and I love that mindset. It's one I wish I could adopt more.
mm,
But yeah, he
amazing.
was wonderful. Yeah, thank you for
Amazing.
that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Why are there not more books written about grief, or it's, it's danced around in conversation with people?
Yeah, I think to be honest, like I think there are a lot of books written about grief, but grief, the science of grief, I think is something quite new. And or before, when we existed in tribes and like small communities, there was this effort of community care. So grief was just part of, the rhythm of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And with modernization, with individualization, there has been this people starting to die, like more people dying in hospitals over our
Mm-hmm.
generation. You know, World War II, the mantra was keep calm and carry on. So been a generational experience of keeping grief behind closed doors. Um, and then also, grief itself is a very individual experience. Each individual is the expert in their own experience with grief.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of memoirs about loss and the grief experience. Um, but in terms of resources built for people who want to be in grief support roles,
Yeah.
um, I think it's something that's coming back around now that we're seeing a rise in, concerns about our mental health and just taking more agency and making sure that our whole well-being is supported. And I think we'll start to see that conversation shift a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Before it was like, oh, we don't talk about sex, and now it's like, okay, grief is kind of like a new frontier,
Mm,
that we need to talk about. It's something that people live with every day, and the more we can bring it out into the open, I think the more human experience, we'll be able to speak about.
Mm-hmm.
mm. You mentioned just before this that I guess the easiest and impulsively most people will say, you find yourself a support group, look at the brighter side, move on.
Mm,
Um, you'll push through this. So what is the
mm.
harm that it can cause for someone who's going through the grief?
I mean, the harm opportunities are endless. I think the biggest thing that I push for is that when you ask people to just kind of swallow it It's that it doesn't go away,
Mm.
right? That grief still lives within you. It is an energy that we live with. It needs to move around and be expressed in however someone feels comfortable doing that. And asking someone to move on, to like keep it hidden, doesn't allow them to express it. It also asks them to have a smaller life, to only share their most like intimate experience with the people that can handle it. And quite frankly, I don't think that's fair. Like
Yeah.
death, particularly, in my brief experience, I did nothing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing everything I thought a good human would do. And then all of a sudden, this person that I love most in the world was taken away from me. And I still want many of the things that a person wants in life, but to have to hide a piece of myself, it's just
Mm-hmm.
not a way that I want to live, and I don't think it's a way that other people should live either. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I think too, if you're not honoring your feelings and your emotions and your own experience, it puts you in a really difficult spot too, right? Especially in this happy-go-lucky society where when you say,
Yes.
"Hey, how are you doing?" the appropriate societal response is, "Oh, I'm good," even when we're
Right.
not. So, I guess that's a good segue into this next question.
Mm.
How does somebody in a support role know when someone that they love is going through grief? And are there stages that somebody going through grief might go through?
Yeah. So in terms of stages, there's the 5 stages of grief that kind of everybody talks about. The interesting thing about the 5 stages of grief is that they were actually adopted from the 5 stages of dying.
Oh.
So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did a lot of research in working with people who are dying, and those 5 stages, the depression, acceptance, et cetera, um, were what the dying people were going through. So then they were applied to stages of grief, which, yes, people will feel those 5 stages, but they can also feel any other feeling on the feeling wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there can be joy in grief. There can be relief in grief if someone was a caretaker for someone for a long time. You know, if the person did some bad things.
Mm-hmm.
um, Grief is a very complicated energy. And in terms of like knowing when someone is going through it, I often refer back to that attachment thing. So was it an idea they were tied to? Like someone has like was going for this goal, and all of a sudden that goal is no longer realistic to them.
Right.
There's grief in that. Someone moving from one job to another, and they were attached to that position. They can be excited about this new role, but there is definitely still grief in leaving something. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, there's death related losses. In this context, moving houses, changing up your home. Like you can be going to the best new house, but if there are memories left
Mm-hmm.
in that old place, there's going to be grief in that transition as well.
I felt
The
that,
truth.
Yeah.
yeah, and we haven't had a guest like yourself talking about this specific
Mm.
topic. And what came up to me for me was I want to say 12 to 24 months ago, there was an agent that was kind of written up in the Reddit thread.
Mm,
And we're taught as agents to always look at motivational factors. And you
mm,
mentioned there's job changes, there's new family members that are born into the family.
yeah.
There's geographic location changes. One of them being a loss of a loved one
Mm-hmm.
in the household, which now there's another change in the family. So
Yeah.
it's ingrained in us to approach these clients because they are probably the leads that would kind of basically turn over a sale for us right away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what happened in this Reddit feed, to make a long story short,
Yeah.
the Reddit feed said that this family just lost like a father, I believe, and
Mm,
they wrote up about this agent that he lacked sympathy, he lacked like empathy to the family because the conversation was all about selling the house right away.
mm,
And it wasn't like that at all. like after speaking with the agent himself. But
Yeah.
my question is how can our listeners are mainly like business owners and real estate
Yeah.
agents? How do our agents approach or interact with the family who's grieving? To how do they best serve their clients so that it doesn't feel like it's the intention is the sale, but it's about helping the family out through the support?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing that I talk about in the book in terms of being a support person is to really rely on your strengths and assets. So, in the grief space, there's the narrative of like, drop off food, send flowers, send a card.
Yeah.
Um, Food is not for everyone, and I recognize that. And I think in this example that you're talking about, relying on where your strengths and assets are, and if you are, a business owner, a real estate agent, you have strengths and assets and knowledge of the real estate area or whatever business you are within, right? So I think it's okay for you to reach out, recognizing that that is what you have to offer. I think the language that you use when you reach out is important. And there's a whole chapter in the book as well about what not to say, a lot of the
Oh,
cliches.
I got to read that.
So, yeah. So, there's like the first thing off the bat is like, don't ask, how are you?
Okay.
Unless you actually have time to have a conversation about that, right? Because
Absolutely.
grief, you can feel so many things all at the same time. And to ask someone, how are you? The reality is that they're probably not okay.
Mm-hmm.
But to ask them to be like, yeah, hey, I'm fine. Um, it's a bit unrealistic, but if you actually want them to answer honestly, it's a very vulnerable place for someone to be, to like actually tell you what's going on. And I've had a lot of experience with people like, how are you? And then I'll tell them, and then, they won't respond for 24 hours. And it's like,
Oh.
hey, that doesn't feel very good.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are going to reach out, I'd say be aware of the language that you're using. Don't use the silver lining, skip the cliches about, at least you
Oh
had,
gosh.
this amount of time with them, at least they
Yeah.
went peacefully, etc.
Mm.
Um, and then also like just acknowledging the loss is so important. Like, don't skip over it. Don't use flowery language. Like, tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, I heard that, so and so passed away. I'm really sorry. I know that, we aren't close or we only know each other in this capacity, but these are the resources that I can offer you if and when you want them.
Mm-hmm.
And letting that person, be the leader. If they want to access you for that information, if they are ready to talk about moving, selling, that sort of thing, like let them know that you are approachable, but let them be the leader in that process,
For sure.
would be my
Would
recommendation.
so would you consider high emotional intelligence an asset in this situation? Because you said everybody's going to be different, right? They're going to experience their own emotions differently. So I would imagine that having a high level of EI would be beneficial, right? In terms of communicating and mirroring and matching the situation.
Absolutely. Emotional intelligence can be absolutely critical, not only for reading someone else, but just knowing yourself as
Mm-hmm.
well. And knowing that being in a situation where emotions are high, the terrain is a bit unpredictable and unstable,
Mm-hmm.
like you also need to be able to take care of yourself as well. Like seeing a loss in others can also be triggering for yourself, and you don't want to have someone who is in the thick of it have to support you too.
Right, right.
Um, but with that being said, I don't advocate for, being like a stone wall if you are interacting with someone, like if they're crying, it's okay to cry. Like
Mm-hmm.
having your emotions reflected in someone is like the greatest like indicator that you are truly listening to someone.
We, as Jenny had mentioned, as realtors, we often get approached by families that have lost a loved one. When discussing the sale of a home with a probate sale, is what we call them.
Yep.
what are some things that would need to be considered, maybe that we're not aware of if we haven't lost a loved one that's been close to us?
Yeah, I mean, every situation is a little bit different in terms of like the human factor, obviously. Um, I think it's important to know that not everyone will be aware of what someone's wishes were in their estate, so that that news might be new to them. That, oh, I'm only getting the value of this home, or I'm only getting 50% of the value
Right.
of this home. So their emotions might be running high because of grief, and then even higher because of this new information
Mm-hmm.
that they're getting. But I think that the most important thing and what I teach in grief allyship is just respect for them as the expert in their own emotional experience and their own grief experience, empowering them to make decisions when they can and need to make decisions. You can give as much as information as you can, but you can't make decisions for them. And then just, I know I talk about unconditional love in the book, but if you're in more of a business transaction, just unconditional positive regard. They're doing the best that they can with what they have
Mm-hmm.
been given.
For sure.
Um, and then on top of that, just consent, like making sure that they are aware of what's happening at each process so they can be at most informed. In other situations, you would call that like an trauma informed approach. Just making sure that they have all the information that they need so that they can do the best that they can with what they have. Yeah.
We obviously talked about the loss of your partner, but there are so many different types of grieving.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What else would be considered a grief?
Yeah. So we go back to like that attachment thing, but I think it's also important to think about how people express their grief.
Mm-hmm.
So there's these researchers named Doka and Martin. They have a book called Grieving Beyond Gender. And they talk about like how people express that energy to be very different. And it exists on a bit of a continuum. So at one end, you have folks who are they would call an instrumental griever. And those are the people who are kind of emotion forward. They do well in support groups. Their grief is expressed as extreme emotions, a lot of emotional expression. On the other end of that continuum, you have what they call an instrumental griever. Sorry, intuitive instrumental.
Mm-hmm.
Instrumental is more of a cognitive process. People express their grief on this end of the spectrum in forms of solving problems, doing research, gathering information. Most people kind of exist somewhere in the middle, but you're often more of one than the other. And then also in the environment that you're in, whether you feel safe enough to express your emotions, and that sort of thing. There's a lot of factors about like who you are that would determine what kind of a griever you are. But I think there's a lot of assumption that if somebody isn't overwhelmed with emotion, that they are not grieving. But the reality is that that's simply not true. They might be a person who just grieves more through doing things.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of misconceptions there.
That's that's actually very, very important information, because the way that we think about our idea of grief or observing it in someone that we love might not even be accurate. So in order to understand what someone else is going through, it's important to be aware of all these things.
Exactly. So
That's
for
really
myself, for
insightful.
example,
Mm-hmm.
I obviously there are big emotions that came with Will's death, but I also like channeled a lot of my grief into writing a book and like doing this
Mm-hmm.
research required to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And just because I've put this book out doesn't mean that my grief is resolved or that it's a problem that's been fixed. It's just a matter of, no, I am a more cognitive griever.
You
And
know,
that's how I will express things.
absolutely. And there are so many of us out there that want to provide support for loved ones that are grieving. So thank you so much for creating this book and taking the time to put your energies and efforts into something that will help so many people.
You're very, very welcome.
I really appreciate it. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about Grief Ally Nation?
Yeah, Grief Ally Nation is a Facebook group that I have. It's also an email list. Anybody can join, and it's really it's part death cafe, part peer support, where people can go and find community. Funny enough, find community in being someone that you love support person. Whether you have questions that you want to ask or you just want to vent when you've made a mistake and you just need to get it off your chest before you circle back with someone and be like, hey, I think I made a mistake. It's a place for you to go to find refuge in this big, messy thing called grief.
There's also another component of the grief allyship training. And what we didn't mention earlier, you are actually a coach, but also a therapist in training. Give us a
Yes.
little bit of background because your certifications and the courses and training you've taken are so extensive. So give us a exactly like what you specialize in and how long you've been in the process of becoming a therapist.
Even backpedaling before the coaching training. So I have a master's degree in social planning, which is along the lines of social work. So I've always been fascinated in supporting people in social justice and human rights and human dignity. And so going from I worked in kind of a city planning landscape, and the scale of and scope of people that I work with is just kind of getting smaller and smaller. So I went from a community based approach, community development, into coaching to work with individuals, and I was working with young people on life transitions. And funny enough, I was dabbling a bit in the grief space, but I didn't realize how significant that was until Will died. As a coach, I had a client who moved from, she was a very successful hockey trainer, athletic therapist who moved into, a very corporate business coaching role. And we held a funeral for her athletic therapist career.
Mm-hmm.
And then Will died. And then I recognized that there was this real gap in support networks. So I kind of applied my coaching training to what tools people needed in a grief support role. But with that, and also my own grief experience and my instrumental grieving style, research was really important to me. So I've done all the continuing education that you can imagine on grief, non-death related losses, traumatic bereavement, working with children who are grieving. And then most recently, I've started a master's in counseling psychology so that I can practice psychotherapy. And I'll be able to do that starting in September. And ultimately, my goal is to work with those who are traumatically bereaved. So people who are experiencing grief because of death related to violence or accidents or natural disaster, where I think my zone of genius and I have a lot of empathy for. So
Tell us a little bit more about the psychotherapy part of it. How is that different? Like what kind of study is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to be fair, like human beings, like within our bodies, just like childbirth is a very natural human process, our bodies also know how to grieve. So the average person doesn't need therapy to move through their grief. What they need is a safe and supportive network to be able to express their grief and to be able to be held as they feel this really like involuntary process that is happening in their bodies. But there can be trauma associated with grief, whether that's bringing up things that you've experienced in your past that are then, kind of being poked at because of your experience with grief, or your loss was, of a traumatic nature. And you need a little extra support, which is what you would get in a more traditional therapy relationship. So that's the book. The book is for, those who are still moving forward, but maybe your ship is taking on a little bit of water and you need some extra hands to like bail out the water. Psychotherapy would be more like your ship has, hit a rock and you are sinking. and we will right your ship so that you can continue to move forward.
Okay.
That's so important.
Yeah. We always top off our conversations with 5 rapid fire questions. And I think I'm going to take this moment to ask of you if it's possible for you to do a little bit of a reading from a section of your book
Yeah.
instead. And I really enjoyed the book launch that you had virtually. And so I felt if you can maybe find a section that maybe some of our listeners can tune into right now. And then also
Yeah.
help us digest like what you went through when you're writing those words.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have, yeah, let's see what the best thing is for me to do. I had a couple of ideas. Um, yeah, okay. I'm gonna read you a piece. It's kind of, I think it's a great wrap up piece. This is the call to action from chapter 1 of the book, and it really boils down to grief support in itself is not unique. Grief support is just what it means to be there for someone that you care about, whether that's, friend, family, partner, just someone in your community that you know. And it kind of boils down to just like being a good human and being a good friend.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'll read it and then we'll see how we feel after that.
Thank you.
You can be a grief ally. In her book Grief Works, Julia Samuel wrote, "Grieving is lonely making. All that missing and wanting and not finding can feel like excruciating loneliness. Warm, caring human contact helps keep the chill out of it. I can't make the pain go away, but being connected and remembered helps your friend to bear it." Julia couldn't be more right. Your person needs you. They need your unconditional love, your courage, and your reverence for what they're experiencing because their beloved is gone. And showing up and giving that support to them is how your person gets to remain your person. In Grey's Anatomy, Meredith and Christina didn't become each other's person because they were enduring happiness. The strength of their personship was determined by being there for one another through the shittiest things that happen in life, including death. And the irony of being able to show up for your person in the worst of times means that you'll be there for each other through the really amazing things too. Weddings, babies, career milestones, lifetime achievements, and more. That's what you're going to be able to do by reading this book. By learning how to be the best source of support for your person, you're equipping yourself with the tools that you need to navigate the immediate shock, anxiety, and chaos after someone dies. But you're also building a foundation that you can rely on for the rest of your personship, not to mention when you inevitably lose someone who is beloved to you, to get the support that you deserve. Being a grief ally is a difficult task. It's not something that any one of us wishes for, but it's one of the most important roles that we can ever embody. So with that, are you ready to be a grief ally?
That's beautiful. I think that was
Yeah.
the excerpt. That's the way
Yeah.
you need to go for
Good.
sure. Aly, I'm sure that a lot of our listeners, this is going to be an amazing episode for them to listen to, as grief affects all of us in our daily lives. And
Yeah.
where can our listeners reach out to you if they'd like to get in touch?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, alybird.com. You can find me on social media at the Aly Bird.
Aly, when there are individuals joining a group, a support group, are there parameters or rules, almost like Al-Anon, where you're not supposed to provide advice or cut somebody off? Like, are there ground rules before you start the sessions? Is there a format to it, or is it just
To Grief Ally Nation or to
I think
any
I
grief work?
guess in general, like, is there a structure to the sessions?
I would say technically no. because each individual relationship would be unique in itself. I think there are some guidelines that you can follow, most of them being in the book themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Each chapter in the book is starts with a guiding promise. And my advice to anyone in being a grief ally is to, follow the steps in the book, but also keep your promises.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
so respecting your person as the expert. Don't fix without
Yeah.
permission. Listen and use the information that you glean from listening in your further actions. Be okay with making mistakes. And then, loving your person unconditionally are just some of the basics. But if you follow those, you really can't go wrong, honestly.
Yeah.
And when you do go wrong, you apologize and your relationship gets stronger because of that.
And those are daily practices in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right?
That's what it takes to, have quality relationships in your life.
Yeah.
For sure.
Aly, this was beautiful. You are beautiful. And we
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you sharing this with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jenny and Tony. It's been lovely to spend time with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.